Welcome back, everyone. It's my pleasure now to introduce Mark Turner. Mark is the Managing Director of MSD Limited and the product manager of and driving force behind Safran Risk Manager. Mark blends 25 years of risk leadership across defence and aerospace. As a certified risk manager with a master's degree in risk and former director of IRM, Mark is a recognised voice in risk culture and digital ethics. Mark's now going to introduce Safran Risk Manager. So Mark, I'm now going to hand the session over to you.
Okay, thank you, Craig. Hopefully everyone can see me. So Safran Risk Manager, which I've been working on since I started working with Safran in 2018. Just to put it into some context, how does it differ from the Safran Risk which we've been talking about so far? Well, Safran Risk Manager is all about the collection of the data across your project teams. So it's essentially a risk register. The idea behind it was that the risk register itself shouldn't be concentrated in the hands of just one person, the risk manager, but should be open to all of the people within the project. So it's the democratization of the risk data, because at the end of the day, it's the individuals who are identifying the risk that should be taking responsibility for it and implementing the actions, because it's only the point where actions are taken after the identification of risk that any value is actually added from the risk management process. Just simply by identifying risks and spending a lot of time faffing about whether it's the right likelihood of occurrence or if it's the right impact, but not actually doing anything about those risks doesn't really add any true value to the project. So the thing that I was most keen on when I came to design Safran Risk Manager was, how do we communicate information appropriately to those people who are not necessarily risk professionals and they don't have a great deal of experience in risk management, but also at the same time for those people who are the risk professionals and that need more of a detailed quantitative analysis of the tool. But that then leads me to another problem, which is, how far do I take Safran Risk Manager in the quantitative realm compared to Safran Risk? And as we've got two products, I was very much limited by how far the Safran Risk Manager could intrude into the Safran Risk quantitative cost and schedule risk analysis. So it was a nice balancing act that I had to perform to ensure that we got the best balance for qualitative and quantitative data, but we also provided high quality data that can then feed into Safran Risk. And indeed, it's the interrelationship between Safran Risk Manager, which would act as the single point of truth for the risk data, and the Safran Risk tool, which could use that same data and run the quantitative analysis on it, which lends itself to sort of be the strength of combining Safran Risk Manager with Safran Risk. So I've talked a little bit there about this idea of qualitative and quantitative risk. And one of the things which is really obvious to me when I first started to designing Safran Risk Manager is that there's a lot of conversation that's talked about the debunking of qualitative assessments of risk with regards to likelihoods and impacts, and much more of a focus placed on the quantitative analysis, the type of thing which many of us in this audience today are trained to understand. However, it's my opinion that a lot of people make decisions about risks based from a more of an emotional perspective than they do on a data-driven perspective. And as such, the qualitative assessment, no matter how poorly you think it performs with regard to being accurate, it actually meets the emotional needs of the people who are going to be using that data to make informed decisions and to take action. And so the qualitative nature of risk assessments still plays a valuable part in the risk manager's approach to communicating, particularly with senior people who are the decision makers. Once we recognised that, we realised that it was necessary to be able to use that qualitative data to better effect in order to essentially leverage the decision makers in the direction which was required, such that if we could drill down deeper into the qualitative assessment and understand the drivers behind the assessment itself, but also the changes between the pre-treatment and the post-treatment position, and understand the actions which were being undertaken to drive that, then we again would have a deeper insight into the quality of the data and the actionable insights that were held within the risk register. At the same time, there was a drive for us to improve the quality of the data which is coming from the risk register into the quantitative models, because the truth is it's garbage in, garbage out, and so the risk manager themselves becomes the gatekeeper of quality. And one of the things which we discovered with the development of Safran Risk Manager is by using a combination of both qualitative and quantitative tools within a dashboard helped us to investigate anomalies within our risk registers, and we can see where mistakes have been made or poor assessments are being made, and therefore we can support our teams in driving up the quality of the data. And once we have better quality data, then we can do better quality modelling. But we mustn't forget what Doug said earlier and what George Box originally said, which is all models are wrong, but some models are useful. And it's always worth remembering that just because you have data within your risk register doesn't mean it's either complete or that it's correct. And hopefully the risk manager's role should be to ensure that we have sufficient data to be modelling and that the data is sufficiently correct to run that model on to get a more accurate outcome. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to dive into Safran Risk Live. Now, for those who haven't seen Safran Risk Manager before, we've worked really hard to try to make the user interface as clear and as accessible as possible, particularly for those people who are not risk professionals. One of the philosophies that I had was, as a non-risk person, I would want to turn it on, I want to make my change, and I want to turn it off. And to try to achieve that, we need the minimum amount of clicks and the minimum amount of unnecessary data presented to a user. So as a user, when you log in, first of all, if you're a non-risk manager, then the data that's presented to you is simply your risks and your actions, and you can make changes to them, update them, and then log off the system. But as a risk manager, one of the areas which you should be conscious of and be responsible for is the context within which your project sits. Because once again, without understanding the context of your project, how do you know that the quality of your risks themselves are going to be meeting the context of your requirements? So as a risk manager, when I first turn the tool on, the thing I'm presented with is a synopsis of my risks, so of my projects, with information with regard to whether they're on track or not, and also how many threats and opportunities that we are presented within that risk register. One of the questions I saw in the Q&A previously was, how do we differentiate between threats and opportunities when running the Safran Risk quantitative models? Well, that's one of the things which we struggled with regard to identifying the difference between threats and opportunities within Safran Risk Manager. But we made the simple decision, we simply flag it. So if a risk is a threat, then it's identified as being a threat. And if it's an opportunity, it's identified as being an opportunity. And then smartly, between the two tools, Safran Risk Manager data, which is an opportunity, can be appropriately converted to its correct polarity within Safran Risk. So there's no discrepancies between running threats and opportunities. within Safran Risk. Okay, I mentioned the dashboard. So the dashboard is essentially the living soul of the risk register. It takes a live feed from the risk register, so changes which are happening within the register are fed to the dashboard, and it's really easy to access a dashboard from the tool. Simply select dashboard against the appropriate project that you want to see. The data is, as I said, live, so changes that are taking place can be immediately visualized. And within the dashboard, there's a whole host of different visualizations which we've developed, which will show you both the completeness of your risk register, but also the quality and the correctness of the register. So, for example, how many risks, be they threats or opportunities, do I have that are in a different life cycle state? Are they unapproved and therefore waiting to be implemented? Have they been approved, or are they closed? And you can see the ratio of numbers quite simply by the number of threats or the number of opportunities presented in this chart here. Okay, we can also differentiate between a threat which is an issue, namely its likelihood of occurrence is very high, compared to the threats which are not issues and therefore have an uncertain degree of likelihood of occurrence. The other insight that you can take, and which is probably lost for most people if they're using an Excel spreadsheet as a risk register, is the closed risks. So how do we know why a risk was closed? And so what we've created here is a chart which indicates why you're closing your risks, because risks can close for a variety of reasons, including they've been successfully treated, they didn't occur because the circumstances changed, or they have occurred and they're impacting you. And as risk professionals, ensuring that we get the correct balance, that we're preventing more risks than are occurring, would be a good indicator of the quality of our risk management process and the application that we have for it. Now, you'll see here within my dashboard, I do have a probability impact diagram, and it's the standard probability impact diagram which would show you the impacts covering a range of impact types, including cost and time and qualitative. But for decision makers, sometimes it's important to focus in on a particular type of impact. So, for example, within here, I do not know which of my impacts are being driven by cost or time or a qualitative driver. So I can easily switch on a filter, and then I can dive into the data. So if I select qualitative, for example, and now I select reputation, I can quite easily see that I've got a high reputational driver risk. And within the dashboard itself, if I select that risk, then it will appear at the top of my dashboard, and I can dive into that information, and I can see the metadata associated with it, and I can also see the drivers, the impacts, the controls, and the actions which I'm taking. So that's one way of looking at the data. But as I mentioned, there are severe limitations on the use of a qualitative assessment. The one which I find the most limiting is what constitutes very high with regards to a qualitative assessment. So if I had a threshold of 10 million, which differentiated between high and very high, and I've got a risk which is at $10 million, okay, that's now very high, but I also might have a risk which is at $20 million, and that's also very high. So it's hard to differentiate the risks which appear in this column on the right hand side. And so we decided that we would introduce within the tool, let me switch off my filter, okay, the ability to create an immediate Monte Carlo chart as well. So there is no modeling that you as a user need to do to create this. It simply takes the risk register, looks for the approved risks, then models those approved risks against its likelihood of occurrence and the distribution of the impact to give you a very simple quantitative analysis. And the purpose of this analysis is not necessarily to go deeply into the numbers, but is more informative about the shape of the distribution. So, for example, I'm looking here at my distribution chart, and I can see on this particular project, I've got, let me take off my S-curves. I've got my pre-treatment distribution looks relatively normally distributed, with maybe a slight peak here on the right-hand side. But when I've taken my post-treatment, you can see quite clearly there's bimodality. Namely, we have two significant peaks within my data. And that would be indicative of having a selection of risks with very similar looking impacts. And so that can give me an insight into, do I have concentrations of risk around a particular financial value? And is that due to simply using qualitative assessments when making the identification, or do we genuinely have a focus around two particular financial values which need to be investigated further? Now, there are several ways in which the profiles can be displayed, and I'm just going to pull up another project which I prepared earlier. So if I pull all the Mexico one in, no, actually, I'm going to pull in the London one. Now, it's a very similar data set, only this time you can see quite clearly that there seems to be something quite different between my pre and my post data. And when I switch through the chart to determine what's changing here, okay, so if I turn off my pre, I can actually see that my post treatment has got extremely long, flat tailed. So these values are coming up very, very large. But this would be essentially hidden within the matrix if I was looking at it purely qualitative. What it's indicating to me is that there's a very low likelihood, but a very high impact value within my data set. So I would want to investigate that to determine whether or not that data was correct and whether or not it's an appropriate assessment of the risk. And I can do that quite simply by looking at my register. And the register has got many features in it, one of which enables you to determine what's going to be presented within the data. And I can look down my post, because I knew it was a post value, and I can look for the high value. And I can see that my high value here appears to be an error, because I've essentially estimated this threat at having approximately $200,000 worth of cost impact, but then post impact it's at 9 million. I do believe that is wrong. So what I can do is I can quite simply change my values within the tool. Okay, this clearly shouldn't be 24 million, but should be 2.4 million. I can now revert that back directly to my dashboard, and as the data is live, you'll see that the information now presented within my dashboard looks more appropriate to the data which I was expecting. So it's quite easy to find the errors within your data and therefore reduce the amount of effort that's required when you're running this through the quantitative model. The other thing which Safran Risk Manager enables you to do is to compare your pre-treatment and your post-treatment values against the actions which you're undertaking. So the next chart against on the dashboard gives an indication of the cost benefits derived from the actions that you're taking. Now, this is achieved by measuring the cost associated with an individual action when you identify the action that's to be taken. Now, let me just come back to the risk register, and I'll show you what I mean by an action. So within a system, let's open this risk here. Within the risk, we have the risk identification steps, which are the metadata associated with the risk, namely what's going to happen, who's going to be responsible for it, how have we categorized it against things like the risk breakdown structure or the deliverables or the phases within that risk. And then we also look at the assessment, namely what's driving the risk to occur, and should the risk occur, the impact with respect to cost or time or a qualitative. Okay. Now, the thing about actions is some actions can prevent a risk from occurring, and other actions can reduce the impact if it's a threat, or they can maximize the impact if it's an opportunity. And we present that data in a bow tie. So this is a very simple bow tie. Let me pull up one which is a little bit more comprehensive. Okay, this one here. So for example, this one here. So if I pull up this risk, which happens to be an opportunity, it has more than one driver of the risk event. Okay, so the risk events are here, and it's got more than one impact should it occur. But we mentioned that the actions can be preventative or protective, and we visualize those by representing them as a shield. Okay, so each of these boxes can be selected and data entered, and that specifically goes down to the actions as well. And within the action, we can identify the anticipated cost. And it's this anticipated cost for either one or more actions assigned to the risk, which then helps us to build that cost benefit analysis model in the dashboard. So if I come back to my dashboard, we can now see here that we're essentially measuring a ratio between the pre-treatment exposure, the post-treatment exposure, and the cost associated with the action to be taken. And we're looking then at which of the individual risks benefits the most from the actions that have been identified. Now, this is key to help the decision makers to understand where they would want to spend their limited resources to get the best benefit or the biggest bang for their buck out of their limited budgets. Now, that's okay when we're looking at it from an individual risk perspective, but how do we aggregate that across the project? Well, you can see here there's a chart on the right which gives you the aggregated exposure before the treatment is taken, and then an indication of how much the treatment is going to cost, an indication of the exposure after the treatment, and therefore the difference between exposure after and exposure before represents the benefits to be derived. So in this particular instance, I can see that my costs associated with this project are about $28,000, and the benefits to be derived are about $1.7 million. So the benefit ratio is significant. So ideally, we want to ensure that all of these actions are implemented, that they're implemented and that they are successful, because there's no point in identifying an action unless you're actually going to undertake it. So there's one more example that I want to show to you, and that is where there might be another error in your data. And if I open up my Mexico City dashboard, this error is an indication that we have too much. Oops, that's not quite worked. That's not what I was expecting. Where was my example risk? Yes, this top one here. So let me just approve this particular risk and come back to my data. So in my dashboard now. So what I've done is I've approved an erroneous risk, and in my dashboard you'll now be able to see didn't quite work. Okay, I was hoping to show you there was an error in the data which was driving my cost benefit to be negative. Okay, that's quite a clear indication that you've got a post-treatment position which is greater than your pre-treatment position. Namely, you've inverted the assessment of your pre and your post values. And that's something which I've seen a number of times when people get confused over, is it a threat or is it an opportunity? Namely, opportunities should have a better position after the fact than before the fact. But within Safran Risk Manager, because we clearly articulate a threat or an opportunity, we need to ensure that we have the appropriate polarities associated with the data, particularly when we're taking that into Safran Risk for a quantitative analysis. Okay, so I hope you'll see that there's a lot of information that can be derived from these charts within Safran Risk Manager. The insights that you can glean from it can find the errors within your data, and also can help you understand the completeness of your data by determining if you have enough threats within particular categories of cost or time or qualitative. And generally what we find is the qualitative risks associated with such things as customer satisfaction or reputation invariably get ignored by people who are focused in on the quantification and the quantitative analysis of cost and time. However, the truth is, significant value is lost by an organization if they ignore such things as customer satisfaction or reputation, because they do come back as a risk and cause an effect. Now, I'm conscious of the time. I have managed to catch up a little bit on our previous schedule. So I'm happy to take any questions that you might have before we move on to our next speaker.
Thank you, Mark. That was great. Really kind of good overview. I'm just having a kind of look. So lots of the questions have actually been kind of answered by Chris and or myself along the way, actually. So we might put you out of a job, but also saved some time for Gustavo as well, which is good. Let me just double check there's nothing else outstanding. No, I think we're all up to date on those. So obviously, as kind of with all these things, probably now people just start to write questions in now the presentation's finished. So if there are any other questions that we don't have time for now, then we can obviously come back to those and look at those later on and get some answers written down for you. So thank you very much, Mark. Much appreciated. I'll be on Safran Risk Manager presentation duty myself on Thursday for the other edition of this for the Americas. So I wish you a very enjoyable holiday whilst you're away, Mark. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doug.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So Gustavo, you're not starting just yet. We've got it was a 5-minute break. So your session is due to start at 1:45. That's UK time. So we'll take a break to 1:45.
Gustavo, do you just want to put the slide up saying, rather than saying back in a few minutes, are you able just to edit it and say we'll start again at 45 minutes past the hour, just so it's clear for people? If not, don't worry, but if you could, it might be good. Gustavo, are you gonna change that manually to 6 minutes, 5 minutes, 4 minutes, 3 minutes, 2 minutes? Forward to seeing that. Maybe put 45 minutes past the hour.